My mother had a son who died when he was 2. His birth caused her to have a lacteal tumor on her liver, which, combined with the continual unhappiness inflicted on her by my grandmother, caused a violent fever to attack her lungs. As she chose not to live a quiet life, at 31 she began to have violent hemorrhages. Eventually, my mother was recommended to go to Spa in Belgium. We were there for nearly a month, and her health deteriorated by the hour. Back in Paris, the Queen came to visit, and every day sent a groom to fetch news of her. But no chaplain was at hand, not even at the end. After her death, I was advised to beg protection from my grandmother, for otherwise, if I failed to humor her, I would be disinherited and sent to a convent, and she would make certain that everyone would think it had been my decision. This last was such a repugnant thought that I submitted to my grandmother, though I was only 12 at the time. For the next 5 years, not one day passed without my shedding bitter tears. As I grew older, I suffered less. Perhaps it was my mind, the strength of my character, or the calm with which I met the calumnies that she spread, even to the Queen, forced her to hold me in a degree of respect. Perhaps she feared that when I entered society, I would talk of all I'd had to endure. Thus it was, when I was 16, she began to exercise some restraint in her rages, although she made up for it in other ways. The household was moved to the country house by the woods of Compiègne. What had been a place of gaiety and brilliance was now a desolate place, because all my mother's friends who had humored my grandmother to make my mother's life easier no longer visited. My grandmother grew bored and persuaded my uncle to move back to Paris. He did this and was advised to buy a house in my name, with him retaining use during his lifetime, because he was already 77. Thus my fortune would be increased without his being decreased. However, he chose to put it in his name alone. By now, I had been exposed to porcelains from China, glazed chintzes from Persia, and other fineries from far-off lands. I was often told it would all be mine one day, but some presentiment kept me from dwelling too much on future splendors. My imagination was more inclined to dwell on thoughts of ruin and poverty, and away from the usual occupations of a young lady and heiress. I wanted to learn all the handicrafts, from embroidery and laundry work to the smallest kitchen tasks. I stored all that I was taught, and I set out to learn from all the visitors who came to the house, so that I acquired a vast range of knowledge, which proved extremely useful in my life. It's beyond my skill to describe society in France before the Revolution, but when I look back over my life, I can see signs of the upheaval that broke out over us in 1789. The excesses of Louis XV had corrupted the nobility. Gaming, debauchery, and irreligion were flaunted openly. The hierarchy of the clergy had also been corrupted by contact with the court. When they returned to their provinces after their yearly visits to court, they proceeded to set the worst example, and in this manner the rot that started at the top was spread everywhere. Virtue in men and good conduct in women became the object of ridicule and were considered provincial. The older I get, the more sure I am that the revolution was the inevitable consequence and the just punishment of the vices of the upper classes, vices that were carried to such excess that if the people had not been stricken with an invincible blindness, they would themselves have realized that they would inevitably be consumed by the very fire they themselves were lighting.